So this is lecture 2 of Religious Encounters in Indian Territory, and this is the lecture where I want to focus on Kiowa Indian perspectives on American arrival into the Southern Plains. But once again, I really want to put land at the heart of the encounter and think about the material conditions of the encounter between Kiowas and American missionaries. And so I want to talk about how Kiowas saw the land as central to their sense of themselves, that they had a developed ritual life in relationship to that land, how they conceived of that land's power, and how they interacted with the powers that they associated with that land, and what it meant for them to change their way of life in relation to the land, which for them had religious implications, and also shaped how they interacted with Christian missionaries, but also the Christian message as it was brought to them was informed by their experience of living on threatened land that they were threatened with losing. So I want to start by just showing you the different lands that they had lived on as a people. This is a map created by an anthropologist who spent a lot of time among the Kiowa in the 1890s. And during that time, he collected stories about Kiowa tribal origins and tribal movement. And what he found, and what surprised him, is that the Kiowas had not always lived on the Southern Plains. That even though they saw themselves as a people grounded there, really created to be in that place, who had special ritual relationship with that place, they had not always lived there. In fact, they had come from much farther north. So I just want to tell you a little bit about their migration and how they changed as a people during the course of their migration. So their kind of longest memories went mostly back to an area of what's now Montana, in the mountains, the Rocky Mountains near the Yellowstone River, the mouth of the Yellowstone River. So they were mountain people. Their earliest memories, their earliest tribal stories talk about being a mountain people. There are even a few stories that go back to a time, or at least project a time even earlier, when they lived in the Canadian Rockies, so up in, much further up in the western provinces of Canada. But many stories come from this time at the Yellowstone River. So before they became this culture that Americans associated them with horses and teepees and guns and buffalo hunting, they hadn't always lived that way. They didn't have horses. They didn't have guns. They didn't eat buffalo. When they traveled, they had at best dogs to pull little packs of things around. So they went through their own cultural evolution over the course of several centuries. We know that they moved onto the Great Plains, the northern plains, probably sometime in the 16th or 17th century. And they moved onto the plains at a time that many Indian nations from both east and west were coming onto the Great Plains. One of the reasons they were is that new things were becoming available that made life on the plains easier. And those things were horses and guns. Horses, of course, were not here prior to the Spanish arrival in the New World. And once the Spanish arrive and bring horses with them to places like Mexico, they become traded through Indian networks going further and further north. So before Indian peoples in North America ever met actual colonizers, they got some of the colonizers' stuff, including horses and then later guns. And having horses on the plains makes living there a lot easier. So Indian nations were starting to migrate toward the plains as horses and guns were becoming available. So when we think about that kind of classic plains Indian, that's really kind of iconic in American imagination, the teepee, the headdress, the buffalo hunting, the horses, that's actually not terribly old. It's really only a few centuries old, at least on the kind of northern Great Plains. So the Kiowas move into what's now North Dakota, South Dakota, sometime in probably the 17th century. And when they're there, they really learn this new style of life on the plains. They learn to ride horses. They become masterful horse people. They learn to use guns. They learn to hunt buffalo. And they begin to establish new relationships and new ways of living associated with a different kind of land. Living on the plains is different than living in the Yellowstone River Valley in the mountains. And so from their other neighbors on the plains, they begin to learn about interactions with this new place. One of the kind of central ways that they interacted with this place was through a ritual called the Sundance. The Sundance was practiced by a variety of plains people. And when the Kiowa speak of the Sundance, they speak of it as being given to them by their neighbors on the northern plains, the Crows. People that they learned lots of things from, how to use horses, how to use guns, how to build teepees. They also learned from the Crows how to give thanks for the life on the plains, how to acknowledge the power of the sun, how to offer thankfulness for the abundance of the buffalo. And so they developed a very elaborate ritual life. The most kind of central form or expression of that was a yearly gathering in the summer for the Sundance. People who were normally spread out over many hundreds of miles would gather together in a particularly auspicious spot where they would build a ritual enclosure. They would go then through a kind of symbolic buffalo hunt in which they weren't allowed to use horses and guns. They had to do it the old-fashioned way, which often involved like running them off a cliff and butchering them in an old-fashioned way. So in some ways it was a kind of acknowledgement of their older ways of life. Then they would bring that buffalo carcass into the center of that ritual space and put it up on a big pole at the center, along with various offerings, cloth, any kinds of material objects that they had considered special. So this pole would include all sorts of offerings, including this central buffalo offering. Then they would perform a kind of pretend buffalo hunt in which people dressed up like buffalo. So you could see the way that the buffalo played a central part, and also a thankfulness to the power of the sun played a central part. And so men, especially young men, would come into that ritual enclosure. They would not eat or drink or sleep for 4 days, and they would look at the sun as a way to show their willingness to suffer pain, to sacrifice, to acknowledge the power of the sun, to acknowledge their reliance on the sun and the buffalo, and really to ask for pity and blessing and mercy. So this was something the Kiowas learned on the plains. And when they finally migrated further south, I'll go back a slide here. When they came onto the southern plains, they brought these practices with them. So they came onto the southern plains probably not until the mid-18th century. Mid-18th century, 1750s. And they came there and found other Plains Indians who they made alliances with. And they were lucky. They made an alliance with one of the most powerful Indian nations on the Southern Plains at that time, the Comanches, who Americans were very afraid of, right? If you'd asked an American in the mid-19th century who were the wildest of the wild Indians, they would say the Comanches. And they allied with the Comanches, and they shared with the Comanches this ritual. The Comanches had not been a community who performed the Sundance, but when they made an alliance with the Kiowas felt that this was something they could offer them. So one of the things I want to emphasize here is that this was a community that changed. Its cultural practices changed, the lands it inhabited changed, its religious practices changed. And they really were, in some ways, kind of suited to place. That when you came and lived on the plains, when you lived in really kind of, when you needed the buffalo to live, you developed an elaborate ritual relationship with that being, with that powerful being, the buffalo, and with the powers that are in a particular place. So as they came onto the southern plains, they shared this ritual with their neighbors in the southern plains and made really strong alliances. They also came to see certain places on the southern plains as special. Mount Scott, which I talked about last time, was one of them, but this, I think, was one of their primary places. They have a name for it in the Kiowa language, and the Kiowa language is incredibly difficult to pronounce. It's a tonal language, so even though I could probably technically pronounce it, I couldn't pronounce it well. Getting the tones is really difficult. There's also hardly any vowels. So I'm just going to give you a translation, which is the Medicine Bluff. This was a place where warriors might go to ask for power and safety before going on a raid. It's where hunters might go, asking for success before a hunt. It was considered a place that you went to when you needed power, protection, safety, health. So as they moved, they brought with them these kind of accumulated practices from other places, but then they also established new relationships with new places when they lived on the southern plains. And so before, I would say in the first half of the 19th century, from like 1790 through about 1845 or 50, they really flourished in this place because the Americans were hardly there. The Americans were very busy with Indians east of the Mississippi, or the ones they had just removed to Indian territory. The Americans had not really made a substantial presence where they lived. So this was a time in which the Kiowas flourished. They had a kind of cultural fluorescence, I would say, in this period. But as I noted in the last lecture, Americans were gradually moving west. They moved westward with removed Indians and established missions there. And eventually, there's a desire for more land even further west in the areas of the wild Indians. And that's at the period when the Kiowa Reservation was first established. So this is a map of Indian territory, and the Kiowa Reservation is down in the southwestern part of what's now Oklahoma, and they shared a reservation with the Comanches and some Apache Indians. It was established in 1868, right after the Civil War, when the United States was really trying to settle the Indian question. And this is when the first Quaker, Lowry Tatum, who I talked about, he arrives on the reservation the year after it's founded. This is an image that was shown in Harper's Weekly of the treaty negotiations to establish this reservation. Americans loved news about the Indian. In fact, for a couple of decades, on the front page of the New York Times every day was an Indian column. So you could get your updates on what was happening in the Indian world. And it's things like that that actually, it gets to a question that came from the last session, that Indians were on Americans' minds. It was on the front page of the New York Times every day. I mean, the New York Times then wasn't what it is today, but it was still the New York Times. So Americans wanted to know what was happening. They kept up on news about Indian war, news about Indian reservations, and here's an image of the creation of the Kiowa Reservation. And it's at this point in 1868, with the creation of the reservation, when they are now supposed to live on a bounded piece of land, that their religious life, slowly at first, but then in a more accelerated way, really begins to change. And it changes in relationship to the land changes going on around them. And I want to tell this story from a Kiowa perspective, which can be very, very hard to do. There's no written Kiowa until the 20th century. So at this period, we have no written Kiowa. We have very, very few Kiowa people who were speakers of English in this period as well. And certainly like a handful who can write in English later in the 19th century. And so what I'd like to do is use other kinds of materials that they made. And here's an example. They're called calendars. Stay with me, because these look confusing, but I'm going to help out. Kiowa calendars are basically visual histories. And there were a few prominent people in Kiowa life in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and actually going further back, who sat down every winter and recorded an image that was about a prominent event from every summer and every winter. So what you see here, one of the examples, it moves in a circle. are small images to recount a memorable event: summer, winter, summer, winter. The one on the top goes back to the early 1830s. The one on the bottom also goes back to the 1830s, and the images are actually on that long space in the middle. The summer image is on one side and the winter images are on the other. And they would sit together and decide what's the memorable event to be recorded. And some of the calendars have different events for different years. So there wasn't necessarily uniformity in what was recalled, but it's one way of getting at how they tracked what was happening to them through this period. So I'm going to use the calendars as best I can to get a sense of how they experienced the threat to their land and how they experienced religious change in this period. And that has basically meant, for me, learning to speak a new language, a kind of visual language, because as you can see, these are not, you can't obviously tell what's going on. And so I've had to rely on the work of anthropologists, of art historians, of people who work at the Smithsonian, and also recorded interviews with Kiowa people who've been asked what their perspectives are on what these documents mean. And to me, one of the most interesting aspects of these documents is that most of them are no longer in Kiowa hands. They're actually in museums. So these records of their tribal history are not something that they own for the most part. So I'm going to use those and trace how there are changes in religious ritual and change how they felt about or experienced limits on their movement, especially allotment. Allotment's going to come up once again. So I want to start with one of the most prominent calendar makers, and really, I think, kind of the greatest Kiowa artist in the 19th century. There he is on the left, a man named Haungua, or Silverhorn. He was a descendant of an incredibly prominent family. His great uncle had been the head of the tribe for about 30 or 40 years, which was the longest tenure of almost any Kiowa leader. It had been during the kind of Kiowa heyday of the early 19th century. So he came from this illustrious family. He also came from a family in which he inherited calendars kept by his older family members. So he had been exposed to the tradition of sitting around in the winter, deciding about events to memorialize. And he took the calendar tradition and expanded it. He began drawing in the 1870s, into the 1880s, 1890s. Actually, he lived into the 20th century, and he made not only calendars that looked traditional, but also in new forms. So the example I have here is a page. He actually made his calendar, one of his calendars, in a book, in a kind of old-time book that sometimes people kept diaries in. And he turned it sideways and started making a calendar. And you can see that he's, I'm going to come around a second so I can see. He marks the transition between summer and winter with a sundeer pole and then a dead tree, or a tree in winter, and then another sundeer pole. So you can see that this is his calendar form in a new way. So Silverhorn lived through all of the land changes in the Kiowa community. He lived through the creation of the reservation, and he eventually he lived through the arrival of missionaries, and he eventually lived through allotment. And he made some really interesting religious choices. In fact, he chose all kinds of, he did not only made new calendars, he did a lot of new things. He was not a Christian. In fact, he was very clear that he really didn't like some of the missionaries who were coming onto the reservation. And instead, he chose to follow a new movement in which people ingested peyote. He became a peyote leader. He also participated in the ghost dance, where people hoped to revive the buffalo. And even though he had lots of concerns about Christianity, I think it's interesting that he drew about it in his calendars. Even though it wasn't something that he necessarily agreed with or participated in, he recorded it as part of a memory of his people. And so he really, in some ways, looking at his calendars, we can see the passing away of certain older traditions and new ones coming in. So here on the left, he features a prophet, basically a prophet came about before the ghost dance who said that he could bring back the buffalo, and lots of people followed him, and it didn't work. But he records that as an event, not something he participated in, but something he felt was significant to the Kiowa story. Or the image on the right, where he records the very last Sundance his people ever had, which was something he would have participated in. And this was a Sundance that they tried to hold in 1890, and that the US military came out to stop. So he narrated how they were leaving certain traditions behind, but how new traditions were coming. So for instance, here, he narrates the opening of a Baptist missionary school that many Kiowa people sent their children to. On the right, he shows the opening of a Baptist church on the reservation. And I think that to me, this is actually telling, because if you read only missionary sources often really focus on the factionalization of Indian communities, the real divide that they saw between Indian Christians and Indians who did not become Christian. And I think one of the things we see in the calendars is that no matter what the religious persuasion of the maker, they recorded everything happening religiously. So Silverhorn was a peyoteist and a ghost dancer, and he was skeptical of Methodists. But he drew churches, and he drew church schools. He included that as part of the story. He recorded the tent meetings that happened around Mount Scott. And to me, this was a really profoundly shaped for me, seeing this in the calendars really shaped how I understood Kiowa religious life in this period. Because I had read so many sources in English by missionaries that focused on what they saw as the divide, not only between Christian and non-Christian Indians, but between Protestant and Catholic Indians, Methodist and Baptist Indians, right? That they really focused on religious difference. But when you look at the Kiowa materials, I think one of the things you see is that they're all Kiowa. Whether you're a peyoteist, whether you're a ghost dancer, whether you're a Christian, whether you do all three, which some people did, it all ends up in the history. It's all there in how people account. So let me show you a calendar from some of the earliest Kiowa Christians. This is a holding that's up in a museum I've got my Texas geography here. It's down in a museum in Amarillo, Texas. It's called the Gauke calendar. And it's thought to have been created by a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Gauke, who hosted Methodist meetings in their home. They were actually evangelized by Methvin, who we met in our last lecture. And to me, what's interesting about the Gaukes is that even as they made the transition into Christianity, they recorded the history of their Christian practice in this traditional calendar form. So I'll describe, you're seeing kind of one section of it. If you roll it out, it's actually about 50 feet long. It's such a remarkable object. I feel so lucky that we have it. So many objects are lost to history. So it's more than 50 feet long. And if you look at, with every calendar, you kind of have to figure out what's going on, what kind of time is being kept, what's being remembered. And so one of the things that the museum director and I figured out pretty quickly was that this is a calendar that marks weeks. And it marks the week with crosses because they meet for Sunday worship. And then it has 7 lines between each cross which mark the different days of the week. And so we knew roughly when this started. And we also saw on other parts that there were little crescent moons. And we realized that there were monthly markings of the new moons. So we got out some calendars, that lunar calendars from the early 1890s, and we figured out where it started. And then we were able to kind of track the calendar to other things that we knew about in Kiowa history. So I'm interested in how they took this old form, but overlapped it with their new religious expression. That now the cross was a way that they kept time, even though they still used the moon also to keep time. They marked church events, and this was something I felt like a historical detective here to have figured this out. And I'm pretty sure I'm hoping to substantiate this with some written records as well. But there were a few places here and there where you would see what looks like a man and a woman with some kind of signs above them. And from reading a lot about Plains Indian art, one thing that you learn very quickly is that when a person is featured, there's usually some sort of sign above their head which gives you a sense of who they are. It's called a name glyph. And so I saw there, it's a man, it's a woman with two name glyphs. These are marriages that the community was celebrating, and there's a few of them sprinkled throughout the calendar. The one on the left, the square with the pieces, I could not figure that out for weeks. For weeks I was trying to figure out because it showed up regularly, but it wasn't monthly, it wasn't annually. I just couldn't figure it out, but it was there regularly and it was always on Sunday. And then I realized it was quarterly, and they're Methodists. It's communion, or as they called it, the Jesus Eat. Because they had, and I think one of the reasons there's a square is that in these house churches, the missionaries had convinced them that what they needed was a table, right? To have proper communion, you needed a table. So I was really excited to have figured this out as well. And that's something also that I want to confirm with documentary records. So I'm going up to Oklahoma City, where some of the early Methodist records for Oklahoma are at, and I'm hoping, this is my hunch at the moment, but I feel like it's a good hunch. We'll see. So they record the history of their communion, the history of marriages, but they too, like Silverhorn, record what other people do. They record the ghost dance. They record things about peyote. So even though they did not necessarily participate, they were people who did not participate in the ghost dance. Some of the other people in their house church participated in peyote meetings, but they recorded everything. And so I think that's interesting for us to think about in terms of how we think about religious life in this period and how we think about Kiowa Christianity. The way that in some ways that missionaries brought a kind of exclusive vision, right? That Indians needed to really kind of leave totally most of their traditions behind, that Indian people did not necessarily see coming into Christianity the same way. And they saw themselves as continuing to be connected to people who practiced a variety of religious forms. I'll show you one more Christian calendar. This is from a fellow named Kitone, and one of his sons actually ended up being the first ordained Kiowa Methodist minister. But he too recorded a wide range of religious expression. This is from his calendar, and it's an incomplete Sundance poll. It reflects the 1890 Sundance that was stopped by the US government. But even though Kitone went to church every Sunday, his calendar is full of the ghost dance. He actually never records anything about Christian church in his calendar, but when he has religion there, it's either a traditional religion, like the Sundance, or the ghost dance. And I have a hunch about this one too. You see the woman in Western dress? I think that's the Baptist missionary who tried to stop the ghost dance one time, because there's no one else who would have dressed like that, like she did at that time. But once again, I have to confirm it. But that's my hunch. So once again, we have Indian people, Christian, not Christian, recording a real variety of religious life. And I would say that another way we can see this willingness to kind of cross boundaries that were very important to Americans is the way that they worked together to fight allotment. that they were also willing to cross religious boundaries, not only in their calendar forms, but in their allotment struggle. And this starts with Americans arriving on their reservation in 1892 to put the allotment in place. It's called the Jerome Commission. I talked a little bit about this meeting last time. And in the minutes of the Jerome Commission, which are in this faded form of microfilm that really hurt my eyes to read, but one of the things that's most fascinating to me, where they took minutes of these meetings that took place over the course of many weeks, is that representatives from every new form of religious life in the Kiowa world are represented here. There are peyotists who speak against allotment. There are Christians who speak against allotment. There are ghost dancers who speak against allotment. And I think one of the reasons that that's significant is that in much of the literature, Indian Christians are often presumed to be the ones that assimilate the most, right? That they're the ones that are willing to do what missionaries say, what the American government wants, right? That they are the ones more than any others willing to assimilate. But Kiowa Christians fought allotment. Many of them cut their hair, many of them changed the way they dressed, many of them built some square houses eventually, but they did not want to give up their land. And they fought allotment just as much as anyone else. So to me, I think that's another way to come into what the Kiowa perspective on American religious life, like the perspectives that they brought as they experienced both religious change and changes in their land. And they reflected this fight against allotment in their calendars. So the image on the left is from a calendar by a man named Black Bear, and it memorializes a trip by Kiowa leaders, a train trip they took to Washington, D.C., where they asked to see the president to fight allotment. The image on the right is from one of Silverhorn's calendars, in which he records a meeting at Mount Scott near the little Methodist church there, where they met to work on to basically strategize their legal battle against allotment. Again, there's meetings recorded on the left. And finally, on the right, you see their loss, that the land eventually gets turned into a square with many plots. And by this point, Kitone had actually learned how to write some words in English, and he wrote the word land there to memorialize, at that point, the loss that they had experienced. But they still fought. Even after everything had been allotted, they kept fighting in court. And they fought as a kind of pan-religious alliance. So this man right here, his name is Lone Wolf. He was the descendant of other people named Lone Wolf, who were very prominent leaders. And it's his name that's given to the Supreme Court case that the Kiowas brought. It's called Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. And he and other Kiowa members traveled to Washington, D.C. They hired lawyers to argue their case. And they came before the Supreme Court in 1902 and 1903 to argue that allotment was unjust, it was treaty breaking, and that it would basically destroy Indian life. They lost. The Supreme Court decided it against them, and it was one of the most important Indian land cases actually in American history, because in it the Supreme Court basically said Congress can abrogate its treaties with Indians whenever it wants to. Doesn't matter if it's unfair, doesn't matter if it's unjust, Congress has that constitutional authority. So it was actually not only a loss for Kiowas, but a loss for other Indian people fighting against allotment as well. We also know about the allotment struggle from missionary documents. So I want to turn for a moment away from Kiowa documents to a missionary document. And this is from a memoir by the female Baptist missionary who got kind of embroiled in the allotment controversy. I'm going to come down once again. So later in her life, when she wrote her memoir, she remembers a day when a Kiowa man, a Christian man named Hinkey, got up in church and said, "One thing I want to know, does the Jesus book, the Bible, say any place that the Kiowa Indians are to have 160 acres of land apiece? Jesus never told us this. It is the white men. The great father made the land and put us on it, and we love the land our great father gave us. The missionaries must help us to keep the white men out. Pray for us that we may keep our land. I have spoken." I love this quote. When I found this quote, I just wanted to jump for joy because I think it's so interesting that they were looking to Christianity in ways that missionaries never could have anticipated. They wanted to know, did the Bible have anything to say about allotment? Because if it did, that might be authoritative. Did Jesus have anything to say about allotment? And he's pretty much convinced it doesn't. And this is, I think, a kind of interesting return then to Methvin, who we talked about in the last lecture, who at one point, when he was trying to get Kiowas to build a house, he says, the government wants you to build houses, and Jesus does too, right? Kiowa Indians heard that message, but they also wanted to confirm, right? They wanted to find out, is that really true? Is it really true that Jesus wants me to have a house and 160 acres of land? So this began a kind of push around literacy for Kiowa people too, because they wanted to confirm what people were telling them about the Jesus book. So as Kiowas experienced a variety of religious change, in this period, almost all of their traditional practices were suppressed and really came to an end. They tried new things, peyote, the ghost dance. They had prophets who rose up among them. There were various forms of Christianity that people affiliated with. They were going through this tremendous time of religious change at the same time that their lands were threatened. And they were being asked to become individuals, to become property owners, to become producers, and eventually also consumers. Right? That to be civilized is not only to produce, but also to consume. Now, I don't want to be romantic about Kiowa culture, because Kiowas liked certain consumer goods, right? They actually loved this stuff called German silver that got traded around. They loved metal pots, right? Metal pots made life easier. So I don't want to pretend that Kiowas did not have an interest in trade, in certain kinds of goods that made their life easier. But they weren't necessarily interested in being individuals. They weren't necessarily interested in being owners. And they weren't interested necessarily in the forms of production and productive labor that Americans were requiring of them. And so I think that it's this backdrop of their material situation that helps illuminate the kinds of religious choices that they made and the way that they came, in particular, into forms of Christianity. So I want to end with two images. This is a map of Kiowa land made in the 1890s by a man named Chadolgunke, or Black Goose. And he was asked by an anthropologist in the 1890s to draw the place where the Kiowas lived. And this is what he drew. And on it, he marked places where they had practiced the sun dance, places they had fought battles. He marked bodies of water, mountains, places where prophets had spoken, places where the U.S. Army had camped, places where they had camped, places they had prospered, and places that they had also suffered famine and drought. And it was a place that, at that point in the 1890s, they were in the process of losing. This is an image. A photographer visited the Kiowa Reservation right around the time that Oklahoma settlers were making their run into the area. And it's an image taken from the porch of Methvin's school. And for a long, long time, Methvin's school had been the only structure in the area, wooden structure. But when the settlers came, things began to be built. Within a few days, there were buildings already put up around him. And a new town called Anadarko was created. And if you remember what Methvin said, this was a disaster from which he never recovered. And it was a disaster related to white settlement, capitalism, and a kind of commitment to production and consumption. And Methvin bemoaned it. But of course, he was also a part of it. And so I feel like, to me, as I have worked through these materials, the conclusion I have come to is that studying missions requires a focus on material condition. And in this case, the issue of land, because it helps us see the way in which encounters, religious encounters, were truly, quite literally grounded. They were grounded in particular places. It's not just two abstract religious systems coming together. It's different people with visions about how you live in a place and flourish in a place, and ultimately conflicting ideas about what that flourishing looks like. Thank you so much.
Well, once again, we have a chance to ask Dr. Graber questions, both the people that are available online and our students here. We have a practice of allowing students to ask the first question, but other than that, it's open. Please name yourself when you begin talking and ask a question, and in one question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brittany Barley. I'm an MDiv student.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could speak to, throughout your lectures, you use the term Indian. So the use of the term Indian versus Native American, because I know in modern study, Native American is now, I don't know, the more culturally appropriate term, so could you speak to that?
Thanks. Actually, one of the things I usually have to do when I do written forms of work is talk about terms at the beginning. And one of the reasons I use the word Indian is because that's the term of choice in the period, both for white people and for Native American people. They identify themselves as Indians. I would say the one, that's usually something in work I will say, right up front, here's why I'm using this term. There's one other way that I think language is really important, is that I try, for the most part, to talk about the Kiowa as an Indian nation. Because they understood themselves as a nation, right, as a people, and try to stay away as much as I can from the word tribe, because the word tribe is a kind of political designation that's in relationship to the United States government, in which Indian people are kind of adjudicated and scrutinized and classified, and some Indian peoples are granted that status and others are not. That's one other place where, for me, the terms are important, and so I try to talk about them as a nation or a people. Thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
My name's Travis. I'm an MACF student. In one of my classes, I remember reading about like the nativistic movement and like the ghost dance, and how there were like actually two different like sections of it.
Yes.
Could you speak more about like the plural, like which one are you talking about? Like, is it the first one and then there's the second one that's like more pluralistic? Could you talk more about those
I'm
differences?
so glad you've heard of both ghost dances, right? I'm excited when anyone's heard of the ghost dance, let alone that there were two of them. So there was an earlier ghost dance movement in the 1870s. It was a much smaller movement. It didn't spread as widely over the plains. And so it was a movement that was started among the Paiute Indians in what's now Nevada. And it had a much kind of smaller following, but it had many of the same principles, namely that there were ways to, that the people were called to do a certain dance, and that by dancing, they were calling out on powers that could bring back the dead ancestors, that could bring back the buffalo, and depending on which tribal group you were talking to, possibly eliminate whites from the American West. So with a variety of explanations about how that would happen. So the movement in the 1870s was fairly small. It has a kind of resurgence in 1889. And when it does, it spreads like wildfire. And one of the reasons it spreads, right, here comes the history of capitalism again, is because there are trains. Indians get on trains and come to Nevada to hear about it. Because you know what, it's hard to get to Nevada on a horse if you're in Oklahoma or if you're in South Dakota. So they got on trains. Lakota people got on trains, Kiowa people got on trains, and so one of the reasons the movement in 1889 and 90 can spread is because Indians have transportation options, and then they can spread the movement when they go back much more easily too. So they have access to the movement, they can also spread the movement. In 1890s, it spreads all over the place. It goes up into Canada, it goes all the way down into Texas, it spreads into the Southwest, and depending on, different groups kind of took it in different directions, and I would say that there was more elaboration of how whites might disappear. And in some of those elaborations, there would be a flood. In some of them, the white people would be swallowed up into the earth. But there was a sense that it was, one of the things that's really important is that it was not something Indians themselves were supposed to do, right? It was not something, the ideology was not one where what Indians need to do is rise up and go take them out, right? These visions about what would happen to white people always involve some sort of natural disaster that would take white people away. But when white people, especially up in North and South Dakota, they were very nervous that this was preparation for war. So, and that is what leads that kind of like mistrust, that kind of fear of this ritual, this ritual that was spreading, really led to violent conflict, especially up in North Dakota. But what's interesting to me is that even after the massacre at Wounded Knee, which is really directly related to white fear of the ghost dance, people kept ghost dancing. People kept doing it, because they still believed maybe the buffalo could come back. They still thought maybe their relatives would come back. So people kept doing it in Kiowa life, people kept doing it in Lakota life. There's examples of ghost dancing into 1915 among the Kiowas. And then the reservation agent threatens to take everybody's rations if they don't stop, so they stop. It might have kept going.
Hi, Deborah Penny, Field Education. So my whole father's side of the family is from Oklahoma. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to hear about this. But I want to ask you a question having to do with agriculture. So Oklahoma's ground is not conducive to produce. How did that affect the Native Americans community?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And in some ways, there was this kind of sad or ironic vindication of people who were like, why are you making people farm on this land? Like, eventually we get the Dust Bowl, right? This is not good place to farm. And we figure that out tragically later. So I would say that this was actually one of the big issues around Indian affairs in the 19th century. The West is a very big place with all different kinds of landscapes. It was full of very different Indian cultures. But there's one Indian policy, right? There's one form of federal Indian policy. And that has been, I think, one of the trickiest parts of, trickiest things for government workers to deal with. Because they could make a policy that might be somewhat successful among one Indian community or a few Indian communities that's absolutely disastrous for others. And I think one of those that was particularly disastrous for people like the Kiowa and others in Oklahoma was that they did not live on land that was worth farming. But no one gave up. No one gave up that they should farm. That persisted until the Dust Bowl.
Mary Chase Solik. In contemporary issues with Native Americans, water access is a major issue. Was that an issue with the land in this time period as well?
So, that's such a good question about water. Not here. Water was not necessarily a problem in Indian Territory. I would say it was a problem, though, for other reservation communities, and especially, this is actually a really big deal in the history of Utah. Because if you'll remember, who are the white people that settle Utah? Mormons. Mormons built amazing dams. They really reshaped the waterways of Utah, and it affected the people who not only, Indian people who not only farmed, but also Indian people who fished in Utah. So Utah was a place where water became one of the prime points of conflict between Indians and settlers, but in that case, particularly Mormon settlers who also wanted to missionize Indians. So I really depended on where you were at, but I think in my mind, in this period, Utah was the place. And there's actually, so I know a historian who's actually working on the history of Mormons and natural resources in Utah, and the whole first half of her book is about Mormons and Indians, because water issues were worked out in those kinds of conflicts. And Mormons eventually were people who headed up the request for dams in Utah in the 20th century, and yeah, so it's an amazing story connected to a religious community.
On behalf of a couple of distance viewers,
All right.
a question related to Mary's question about water is a question about mineral rights. Was there anything there that the native population had a right to or spoke on? This
is why the Kiowas were left alone as long as they were, because there was nothing mineral, like there were no mineral resources that were discovered that Americans wanted. Because minerals were at the heart of the struggles up in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana for the Lakota people. And so, I mean, and this is the amazing thing about Oklahoma. I mean, I find that part of the world beautiful. I think it's beautiful. Americans, for the most part, were not super excited about that land because it didn't have minerals. It wasn't the greatest farming land. But eventually, the point really becomes we've got to get all of these people settled. All of these people need to get settled, and more settlers need just homesteads, even if they're not great farming homesteads. So I think that's one of the reasons they're left alone. That's why they don't get a missionary till 1887. That is so late in the history of missions and Indians. It's so late. They never met a Catholic missionary even, wandering around, which almost every Plains group at one point met a Catholic missionary, but they didn't have stuff that people wanted.
Let me follow up with one more from a distance viewer, and that has to do with the Kiowa Christians, and going back to the quote that you had earlier about where in the Bible was it written about 160 acres. And was there an understanding among Kiowa Christians to turn to a theology of creation and the Creator to resist allotment?
Ooh, that's good. I haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. When I think about the evidence I've seen where Kiowa people found connection to the Christian message, they definitely found connection around Jesus as a healer, around God as someone who could take pity on them and protect them. Those were common kinds of prayers, traditional prayers for pity, for power, for healing. And so they definitely, there's a really interesting genre of Kiowa hymns produced in this period. And very many of them ask for pity, ask for mercy, ask for power, ask for healing. So those themes were quite popular. And it might be that there's not a turn to this creator language because their own notion, their own traditional notion of how the world was created did not involve a personalized deity. It's a little bit more kind of an abstract story. So they don't necessarily have a creating divine figure in their own traditions. So it wasn't something that would very easily map on.
Jesse, MDiv student, you used the word inclusive to talk about the Kiowas and exclusive to talk about white European, especially settlers.
Mm-hmm.
Assuming inclusivity is what we're looking for in missions, is there something in the Kiowa faith, the religion, their culture, that leads to that, or is there something missing in the European culture that we don't do that?
That's a really hard question. And it has to do, in some ways, with the nature of how Christianity has developed, in terms of the way that Christianity has often been lived out in a way that it makes an exclusive claim on people's allegiance. And so that then the requirement, and this was unquestioned by white people in the 19th century, that this is a tradition that requires an exclusive allegiance, and one must turn away from idolatry, savagery, heathenism. So that sense of exclusivity, I think, was unquestioned, and it comes out of a kind of long history in Christianity as it was articulated in a more exclusive form. And I think that that's related to the history of Christianizing Europe, which was largely pagan, the history of Christian encounters with Islam, in which, once again, they're also kind of encountering another tradition making claims at allegiance. So I think there's a lot of things historically that shaped the way that this became an expectation about an exclusive claim. One of the reasons I like to emphasize how Kiowas changed religiously over time, which is not to say that Christians didn't either, right? Of course, we can map those extensive changes as well. But is that for Kiowas, religious life was about seeking empowerment and being in relationship to and attuned with things that were powerful. And so you wanted to get yourself in line with the powers that were there. So if you lived in one part of the world, the powers might be one thing. If you lived in another, the powers might be another. So if you moved, there might be new powers. There might be powers you've never heard of before. And so I think that in that example of how they came to do the Sundance when they moved onto the plains, I think that's part of this experience of, like, there are new powers here. And if we're to flourish, we have to be in relationship with those powers. And so I think one of the things that happens when Kiowas were introduced to Christianity is that for many of them, it's not necessarily a sense of like, that can't be true because only our thing is true. It's a question of testing that power. Is Jesus a power? Is he a great power, as the missionaries say that he is? Will he heal me? Will he protect my family? Will he pity me? Will he protect me in battle? And so I think one of the things that you can see as Kiowas, and I think other plains groups were introduced to Christianity, is that there's a kind of testing. And that for people who came into that tradition and affiliated with Christianity, they had some sort of experience in which the testing was confirmed. They were healed. They were protected. They felt like they were given mercy. And then they would talk about that experience with other people that brought in other relatives. I mean, often this passed through families. So I think it has to do with a sense of like, of conceiving just religion at a very kind of abstract level. What is it? And they came out of a place in which the world's full of powerful things, many powerful things.
Stephen Chester, you focused a lot on material conditions and on land in particular, but you've mentioned a couple of times the loss of the buffalo. How significant is that as part of the story?
Great question. So the buffalo are basically gone by the mid-1880s. And it's interesting, when people talked about the Indian problem, white people talked about the Indian problem, one solution, according to some people, was to simply kill all the buffalo. If you killed all the buffalo, their cultural system would be gone. They would have no need to roam around anymore, and their religious system would be undermined. So there were some people that thought that the way you solved this problem of this cultural difference was to simply kill the buffalo. Now, there was no concerted effort to wipe out all the buffalo so as to change Indian culture, but eventually Americans did wipe out all the buffalo for reasons of sport, for reasons of fashion, and by the 1880s they're gone. And this, I think, leads to the crisis of the Sundance. How do you have the Sundance when you don't have abundant buffalo? And there's a few years in the calendars where you can see that there's no Sundance. 1886, 1887. No Sundance. Why? Because they can't find a buffalo. One year, they actually go to Texas and buy a buffalo from a rancher and haul it back because they can't find one in the wild. So this, I think, has a lot to do with the way that older traditions begin to, not only are they legally suppressed, but they lose their meaning in certain ways, right? What does it mean to perform that Sundance when the buffalo are no longer there? And so it's really interesting when you read interviews with Kiowa people talking about the end of the Sundance. Many of them will not necessarily focus on the legal suppression, right? That the army came out and stopped them from doing it. But often they will talk about how they didn't need to do it anymore. That at a certain point, it just wasn't practicable. And it wasn't going to do anything for them as a people anymore. And that, to me, also gets at how there's willingness to change. They change things up when conditions demand it.
Wow, we have a little bit more time. Does anyone have one last question?
Can I tell you one last quick story? Yeah, absolutely. So my other favorite quote about Indians in the Bible, because I didn't find a way to work it in here, but I think that it's really interesting the way that Indians looked toward Christianity and the way that they spoke back to the way that Christianity and civilization were entwined, right? Moving toward American civilization. So my other favorite quote, other than the one about allotment, there's this, the same Baptist female missionary, she was trying to get one of her converts to cut his hair. And she tells him over and over again to cut his hair, you're a Christian now, why do you have this long, wild hair? And so finally he says to her, why should I cut my hair? I look like Jesus with this hair. Jesus had long hair. White women have long hair. So Indians and white women are like Jesus. White men are the problem. And, so to me, that's just a kind of interesting way, that you have to keep your eyes out for the way that people take the Christian message and see the Christian story and do unexpected things with it. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.